Welcome everybody to the Giving Insights event. For those of you who haven't met me before, I'm Sandra King. I'm the Chief Philanthropy Officer at the Community Foundation. I'm just going to say a few quick words about the context of today's event and the plan for the session. So this is the first Giving Insights event that we have run. And the idea came from a survey that we did with our donors and fund advisors before Christmas. And we asked people if they would like to come to an online webinar event, and if they would like to, what kind of topics would they be interested in hearing about. So half of the people said, yes, please, let's try a webinar. And not surprisingly, most of the topics had something to do with coronavirus. Either how have our charities and communities been affected by coronavirus in the last year? How have Community Foundation grants made a difference to those communities? And what do we need to be thinking about in terms of going forward to help our local grassroots charities recover and help the communities that they're there to serve? I'm delighted to say that our Chief Executive, Rob Williamson, is here to give us his thoughts on all of those topics and possibly more, which is fantastic. And what's also brilliant and will help to bring the afternoon even more alive than Rob does is that we have Craig Bankhead, who is Chief Executive of Gateshead Older People's Assembly. And Craig's going to be giving us the view sort of from the coalface, running a small grassroots charity in Gateshead for older people, which was very much all about bringing people together. How have they coped? How have they dealt with that? How have they continued to serve the communities they're set up to serve? How has a Community Foundation grant helped them? And going forward, what are the challenges that Craig's facing and similar charities to Craig's, small grassroots charities, what are they facing, and how can our funding, your funding, help to support that? Just two pieces quickly of housekeeping. We're recording this webinar, but we can't see or hear you, so don't worry if you did join in your pajamas. I'm sure none of you would do anything like that. But we're recording it so that we can share it with people who couldn't join us this afternoon. And please do use the question and answer function, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and any questions that you want to ask Rob or Craig. And there's plenty of time after their presentations. We've allowed plenty of time for them to answer your questions. So please do log them, and Rob will pick those up once he and Craig have finished talking. And that's all for me. Enjoy the afternoon, and I'm going to hand over to Rob now. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Sandra, and good afternoon, everybody. This is the second sort of session like this that I've spoken at, and it is a slightly out-of-body experience because as the speaker, you are sitting looking at your computer screen, and I can't see you, but you can see me. So as Sandra said, if there's anything that comes up during the course of what I'm saying or anything else in the afternoon, do use the Q&A function, not the chat function, the Q&A function, and we'll be keeping an eye on that during the course of the afternoon. As Sandra said, I'm going to cover kind of three main things in the next sort of 20 minutes or so. First of all, I'm going to chat a little bit about what the world looked like immediately before COVID-19 for local charities and community organisations. I'm then going to go on to say a bit about the impact the pandemic has had on them and how they and we responded. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the longer term impact and what future recovery and renewal for community organisations and charities in our area looks like. The next 20 minutes or so is going to be a bit of me talking. We've very deliberately not done this as a slideshow. This is kind of, if you like, stuff that's in my head that I'm speaking to you about. So bear with me. There is going to be a bit of me on your screen for the next 20 minutes. But so we get everybody kind of plugged into the topic. we wanted to start off by asking you a question as attendees this afternoon. So we're going to do a poll, which in the background, my colleague Ali is going to help me with. And we're going to ask you very quickly, there's no right or wrong answer, but just to kind of get a sense of the virtual room, if you like. Out of a list of 5 options we're going to give you, we're going to ask you to tell us which of these 5 things you think has been the single biggest challenge for local charities and community organisations in responding to the pandemic. So Ali, can you start the poll? Great, fantastic. So please just pick one of these that you think has been the biggest challenge so far for community organisations. So you can choose from loss of funding, loss of volunteers, having to work or run services remotely, increased demand on services, and government policy and support. So pick which one of those you think has been the single biggest challenge, and it's just kind of get an interesting idea of what people are thinking as they come in to the session this afternoon. And we're going to do another poll later on. So just a few seconds for you to make your choices. So everyone had a chance to make a choice. Like I said, there's not a right or wrong answer. It's just to kind of see where we're all thinking at the moment. Okay. Ali, can we share the results? Okay, very interesting. So we have there that the majority of you think that having to work or run services remotely has probably been the biggest challenge, and after that increased demand, and then lower down loss of funding, and at the least fewest of you have selected loss of volunteers, and nobody selected issues around government policy and support. Okay, that's very interesting. So we'll see. It's not exactly the same poll, but we're going to come back to some of these issues later on, and it'll be interesting to see whether any perspectives have changed. Great. Okay, thanks for that, Ali. I hope that was a kind of interesting set of questions to just stimulate thinking. So as I said, I'm going to start off by talking very briefly about what the world looked like immediately before the pandemic hit for local charities and community organisations. And we've got a really good idea about this because the Community Foundation commissions a major long-term programme of research about our sector, by which I mean charities and community organisations in North East England. And we've got data going back over a decade about the state of the sector in the North East of England. And actually, the most recent full-scale survey was done at the end of 2019. So we've got very up-to-date data of what everything looked like immediately before the pandemic hit. So in terms of facts and figures, we know that there are around 7,200 charities and community organisations in the region. They are employing, or they were employing, around December 2019, 38,250 people, and that's about 3% of regional employment. Now, 3% might not sound like very much, but it's more of the region's population that are employed in agriculture, for example. So if you think about all the attention that agricultural policy gets compared to the charity sector, and that perhaps puts that in some perspective. Alongside those paid employees, organisations in North East England were responsible for around 150,000 volunteers who between them were doing unpaid work that if it had to be paid for, so if somebody, funders, the state had to cover that work and pay for it, it would be about £150 million. to offset that volunteer time. So a huge significant contribution by volunteers. But the kind of key thing that I want to say about where the world was before COVID-19 was the survey data we have shows that charities and community organisations in our area were actually feeling pretty optimistic at the end of 2019. They had kind of ridden through 10 years of austerity, and there was a real sense from that most recent data about a sector that was perhaps looking more brightly at the future than it had done for a while. So, you know, always issues and always differences depending on different types of organisations, different sizes, different fields of activity, but a kind of broadly reasonably positive picture. So what impact did COVID-19 have, and how did local charities and community organisations and the Community Foundation respond? Well, one of the things that we saw very quickly at the start of the pandemic was there was in fact an immediate impact on volunteers and volunteering. And that's because lots of organisations, particularly small local charities, were heavily reliant on older people as their volunteers. And that sort of makes sense because older people, retired people, tend to have more free time available and often are quite well connected in their communities and will get involved in community activities and will have that tradition. And so with the kind of impact of the immediate lockdown and with issues around shielding, there was definitely an immediate impact for some organisations on finding that they didn't have the volunteers available that they thought they would. There was an immediate impact on organisations' ability to generate their own income. Now, almost all charities and community organisations, however small, generate some income of their own. It might just because they do a bake sale, or it might be that they've got a community centre and they hire out some space, or it might be a bit more complicated in terms of they might have a contract to deliver some sort of service. And much of that direct income generation, fundraising, earned income, venue hire, all of that obviously was among the first things to kind of be have to be shut down as a result of the lockdown arising from the pandemic. There was clearly also, for the same reasons, massive disruption to organisations' delivery of what they were doing. So lockdowns, but also requirements around social distancing, around protection of staff and volunteers, and linked to that, issues around organisations' digital capacity. So, and I'm sure Craig will talk about this, the ability of organisations used to doing things physically and in person to switch to doing that remotely using digital tools. I mean, I think we've all been on that journey in our own lives, with our own family and our own working lives, in terms of getting to grips with this technology, and no less so for charities. But many of those smaller organisations certainly didn't have the kit and perhaps the training to get up and running in those kind of ways immediately, and didn't necessarily even have the kit available to just, you know, have a small staff team of maybe 5 people working in their back bedrooms and able to have a meeting together. And all of that was stuff that small organisations faced. And certainly there was increased demand. A good example that has been talked about quite a lot, I think, in the media has been around food banks. So a huge increase in demand on food banks, and what you'll hear a lot is that the client group for food banks, the people coming to food banks and asking for help, changed. So food banks have obviously dealt for some time with people living in poverty, including people who work, because I'm afraid work doesn't always pay, but increasingly people struggling because of part-time furlough, or because of being made redundant, and all sorts of other issues bringing increased demand, and food banks is just one example. We could talk about many more. Because we had our most recent research on charities and community organisations come up immediately before the pandemic hit, we did a sort of quick and dirty follow-up survey in the summer of 2020, just to kind of take the temperature of organisations and get a sense of what was going on. And one of the key findings for that, and there's much more about this on our website, but one of the key findings was that there was a real collapse in that confidence. I talked about that optimism that we had seen immediately before the pandemic. And it's a factor of small charities and community organisations that they tend to be quite confident about their ability to raise more money and to generate income, and that had really dropped away as a result of the pandemic, and quite a lot of fear that money would disappear pretty much entirely as a result, given the lockdown, etc. So what kind of things did we as a community foundation do in response? Well, I think probably most of you on this webinar are aware that we set up our own coronavirus response and recovery fund, and we had done that as the very before the very first lockdown started, and we also were the local organisation distributing money raised through the national coronavirus appeal, which was run by an organisation called NET, the National Emergencies Trust. And through both of those, both through our local fund and through the National Emergencies Trust, we raised about £2.7 million from both those sources, so from existing donors, but also from national sources and new donors locally. And to date, so coming up to about the end of March, that's resulted in us awarding around £2 million in over 300 grants for organisations to provide that kind of relief and response work in light of the pandemic. So again, there's data available, and we can give more data about the kind of things that we've done, but we've supported the food banks to reframe and extend their services. We've supported organisations like Bellevue in Northumberland, which works with older people, and we've supported loads and loads of community-led organisations like the Jewish Community Council of Gateshead to provide that family and community support and advice that has been so vital through the pandemic and through the various stages of lockdown. But as well as the very specific funding that we've provided in response to the additional needs arising from the pandemic, we've also, more widely than that, adjusted a lot of our grant making. So obviously, quite a lot of our grants were that were kind of out in the world had been awarded late in 2019 or early in 2020, and obviously we had to say to organisations, if you can't do what you expected to do with that money, either delay what you want to do or repurpose it for something that's useful now, or put it towards your core running costs, whatever is most sensible. So we tried to be as flexible as possible. And we also did quite a lot of work to help organisations in ways beyond grants. So, for example, working with partners like Muckle, we put on webinars to help organisations do things like get their heads around digital, or get their heads around the rules of the furlough scheme. So there were lots of kind of added activities that we did alongside the direct grant making. So what is the longer term impact, and what might recovery and renewal be like? I think in some quarters, commentators have talked about the pandemic as a great leveler, but that's not really the case. The reality is the pandemic has hit poorest areas the hardest, and we can see that in their higher mortality rates. And that's very much linked to a kind of increased health inequality, which is partly about places that were already where health was already worse, and that's worsened, but it's also about particular groups and communities. So that would include disabled people, learning disabled people, older people in residential care, but also, very importantly, Black and Asian communities who have been disproportionately impacted. So we have all obviously been impacted by the pandemic in all sorts of ways, but it has fallen hardest on particular places and particular communities. And I think we're all acutely aware of how the pandemic has really exposed the frailties of the UK social care system. And there are some, really challenging and distressing things that have come out of that. Clearly, there's also been an impact on mental health, again, particularly acutely for people who had pre-existing mental health concerns, but also whole swathes of people experiencing perhaps more severe mental health issues than they have had before. And also, we've all experienced isolation, and that has affected some people more severely than others. And obviously it's impacted on education for a lot of our children and young people. You may also have heard that there have been particular concerns around domestic and family abuse, particularly as a result of lockdowns, and concerns around it being much more difficult for people to get help in cases where the risks to themselves are actually in the home, where they are being forced to remain. And we are aware, obviously, about the long-term health impacts which some people have experienced through so-called long COVID, etc., etc. There are also the economic impacts. I think, clearly it's particularly concerning about what job markets might be like for younger people, those entry-level jobs in retail and hospitality, and where that fits in the job market going forward and what the prospects are. But also more broadly around the kind of town and city centres, the closure of our cultural venues, and what happens if people don't flock back to working in city centre offices, and what that means for town and city centre economies. In terms of charities and community organisations, I think particular issues around the availability of the kind of emergency response money that we and other funders have provided, which I think, and Craig will talk about this, has helped organisations get through, but lots of concern, I think, about whether that tap gets turned off and what happens after that, and how funding is perhaps distorted in the longer term. I think there are fears around the impacts on volunteering, and a realization that a reliance on older volunteers is important, but exposes some weaknesses, and there are challenges around attracting younger people. And I think nobody in the poll earlier thought government was particularly the biggest problem. I guess what I would say is, compared to government's response to business, its response in terms of supporting charities and community organisations has been lackluster, if I were to put it politely. And the very light touch approach which has been given to supporting private businesses has certainly not been replicated for small charities and community organisations. And given the fact of that increased demand, I think the government's response has been pretty weak in comparison, and I wouldn't be the only kind of person that's made that comment. It's not all doom and gloom. There are kind of three things which I think are interesting positives which have come out of this, which kind of feed into the longer term. First of all, I think local charities and community organisations have demonstrated astonishing entrepreneurialism and adaptability. Gateshead Older People's Assembly is a great example of that, and you will hear about that in a second. But just the ability of organisations to kind of, pull our socks up and go, right, okay, well, this is the new reality. We've got to get on with it. We want to keep reaching our beneficiaries, and we've got to find new ways of doing it. And I think there has just been incredible entrepreneurialism there, and we don't talk enough about the day-to-day entrepreneurialism of this sector, and I just think it has been astonishing. Not many organizations just kind of threw their hands in the air and went, right, we'll furlough everybody and we'll come back out of hibernation when it's good to do so. Most organizations we know have tried to keep going as best they can, and have found new ways of working in the course of doing so. We think that there has been something really positive from this renewed valuing of the local and of neighbourhoods and of giving. And I think lots of people have experienced volunteering and giving of their time, and in some cases their money, and seeing the impact of that where they live. And obviously, as a community foundation, that's music to our ears, because that's everything that we're about. And I think that realization of how important place and locality and community is could be a really positive thing to come out of this. And I think in terms of the funding landscape, what I talked about, that shift towards perhaps trusting organizations more, and not expecting organizations to jump through hundreds of hoops, and actually saying, look, you know best what to use our money for, and as long as you're kind of well run and well organized, we'll give you a grant and trust you to get on with delivering what you think is best for your community. I think it would be fantastic if that shift that we've seen in the past year or so was really sustained beyond the pandemic. Those of you that have done your sums will be aware that we haven't spent all the money that we've raised in response to the pandemic, and that's very deliberate. We've held probably around about £800,000 or so back. We also have some money from other sources, and that's very deliberately going to be designed to support organisations that are working with those communities that have been hardest hit. And we're going to try and help those organisations recover and renew in response to all of those challenges. And we're going to be we're working right now on allocating plans for allocating that money for core running costs to help those organisations. It might be to help them offset loss of income. It might be helping them with additional and unplanned costs, or it might be about further adaptations for that new context. So I'm going to wrap up before I hand over to Craig. If I had to sum up, I would say we're going to be living with the virus and its impact on prosperity and health for years to come. That impact is going to fall hardest on people living in poverty, people with mental ill health, and communities facing prejudice and discrimination. We at the Community Foundation are going to be looking at all our funding with a recovery and renewal lens. Government certainly isn't going to provide all the answers, and probably not much of the resource. So there is a key role for more and better philanthropy in the mix. So I'm going to end there and ask Craig to talk to us a bit about, as Sandra said, the kind of coalface experience of Gateshead Older People's Assembly, and whether anything that I've said actually is real and genuine and relates to people's experience on the ground. So as Sandra said, Craig is Chief Executive of Gateshead Older People's Assembly, which is a small charity, obviously based in Gateshead, which the Community Foundation has supported over the years. And Craig will tell us a bit about how the pandemic has been for them and how you see it going forward. And then once he's done that, we'll have a bit of a chat, and then we'll open to questions from the virtual floor. Craig, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob. I appreciate that. Lovely introduction. And I would like to say absolutely 100% agree with everything you've just said. So absolutely on the money. I've got a sore neck from nodding in agreement for the past 10 minutes at everything you've said. So you'll be pleased that I agree with that. as will the participants. I've got to just briefly share my screen with this PowerPoint. If you bear with me 1 second, I can do this, and I'm going to do that. Go back up to the top. Too many spoilers. There we are. Slideshow. I'm working on the assumption that everyone can see my screen in the same way.
Pretty sure they can. Yeah.
Fabulous. Excellent. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about what we did in the last year, how we got on, and how we see the future, just as Rob said. So there we are. So this is everything pre-March 2020. In a nutshell, that's us. Gateshead Older People's Assembly supports the health and well-being of older people from right across Gateshead, and it aims to promote and prolong independence by providing opportunities to socialise, to exercise, and to learn. And as you can see from the photographs, this takes place almost entirely indoors. And then March 2020 happened. We immediately closed our building and we went home to put our thinking caps on. We're a very small organisation, approximate average turnover around £170,000 a year. We've got 3 members of staff, but we have many, many beneficiaries. But what does an organisation that brings people together to socialise, exercise and learn do when there's a global pandemic and a national lockdown? We had to look at the space that we had, both indoors and outdoors, to see what we could do. We figured that indoors wasn't going to happen, so we had to look at the space that we had outdoors. I'm going to admit to you, I think it probably was even taken on a sunny day, but the clouds just reflected how grim the outdoor area looked. It was pretty poor. We haven't really done a lot with it. 2 old shipping containers, bit of a jungle, and it took, I think, as I've written at the bottom of this slide there, in estate agent speak, it had lots of potential. But the team and I saw the potential, and we thought, do you know what? If you take those shipping containers out, move a few things around, cut back those hedges, put something nicely down, that's a big 12 by 8 metre area, we could maybe do something with that. So throughout April and May of 2020, last year, you can see top left there, there's a chap, probably dangerously, using a steel saw to cut up the shipping containers. And eventually, over a couple of months, we got this done. We asked our funders, including the Community Foundation, who very kindly offered us some support to actually undertake this, because capital works is not something we've done significantly a lot of in the past, but capital expenditure was very much what we needed at the time, and the free rein to be able to do things very quickly and not have those restrictions. And again, as Rob said earlier on, so we set about making an outdoor exercise area, because we knew that exercise was going to be allowed and that restrictions were going to be lifted in terms of people meeting outdoors. And from June right up until October 2020, we offered 18 free outdoor classes every week in our 12 metre by 8 metre outdoor area, and there's a whole range of different things. We can see Tai Chi, walking, football. Gary's got a cricket bat. And of course, it's not just the exercise that people are taking part in. People met in this area with the blue floor. You can see there, for a drink afterwards, a socially distanced cup of tea, because people had missed one another. People had missed talking to actual other live human beings. So it wasn't purely about the exercise. It was as much about the social side of things too. So we did that for 5 months, and 3,000 plus attendances over that period. Many people, though, were doing online classes, and not everyone could reach us. Not everybody could come to us. Some people were still shielding. Everyone was doing Joe Wicks, apparently. I wasn't. And we were concerned for the third of older people. Almost a third of people aged over 65 don't have access to the internet. So we think, what about those people? What about those people who are shielding, aged over 65, and who are unable to sort of exercise and know exactly what to do? So what we did do, again, we approached the Community Foundation and the National Lottery Community Fund, and we secured income to create Keeping Well at Home TV, which was a television programme we did in conjunction with Northeast Live Television, which broadcasts right across the region from Berwick right down to Teesside. And we produced 60 episodes, all still available on our website and YouTube channel. It was broadcast 7 times a day to 100,000 viewers, and that was broadcast right throughout July and November. And as you can see there, we filmed it in different locations, and kind of so for all the people who were shielding in the house, it sort of felt as if not only they were taking part in exercise, but they were getting to go to the Angel of the North or getting to go to the beach and things like that. So that's something that was really big, and the feedback on that was fantastic. Many older people who didn't have the chance to exercise were able to, and they developed a relationship, I guess, in a kind of way with Emma and Richie, who were delivering the classes. So that was that. And then so that ended in November, as did the outdoor classes. What do we do then? Well, we'd spent the whole summer and autumn working with our beneficiaries who came along and those who we were on the phone to, and we got them upskilled with learning how to use Zoom. And from November, again, thanks to a grant from the Community Foundation, we were able to bring everything indoors, and we had, I think it was 16 or 17 different Zoom classes taking place every week. It wasn't just exercise. You can see top left there that there was an art group as well, but it was dancercise, Tai Chi, all of those things listed on there. And we had, right from November, in fact, it's still going on. We did a massive evaluation of the Zoom activities that we were doing with more than 100 participants in the survey. And the feedback was such that 3/4 of people actually wanted something to continue even when face-to-face exercise and activities can resume. So we're still doing Zoom. In fact, we had a Zoom dancercise class earlier on with 15 people in it, even though things have started again, as you can see here. So from last week, we have our new exercise area yet again. We've put some fence around, you can see, since last time. And we've got this lovely new roof structure, which is a permanent thing, which means that we can do it even when it rains, which, on the hill, on top of a hill in Gateshead, it does quite a lot. So we've got a lovely new roof. That was a capital bid from Sport England, allowed us to do that, which was really good. Bottom left corner, you can see there, we're also planting a Wildflower Meadow up the back of our centre, just up here. So these are going to continue right until probably August, hopefully September, and it's absolutely fantastic. People love it. People were dying to be back. Been speaking to 3 or 4 people today who are saying, thank you. Nobody else is doing this. It's really good to have the opportunity to do this, and people are back, they're having fun, they're enjoying themselves. And I think what's important as well is that in the past year, since opening these things up, and since there hasn't been too many things available for people, we've got loads of new beneficiaries as well who will continue to come back to us even when things return to something near normal. I would say sort of 25% of the people coming along are people we've not met before, which is excellent. It's really exciting. On to the finance. This is the past 4 years. To give you some context, it was quite a year, as I said at the title of the presentation. It really was. Our expenditure grew, increased by 63%. 68%, and our income had to grow as a result by 54% to meet that. Sincerely hope that's a blip. Don't think we want to sustain this, and I don't think we need to. There was a lot of capital expenditure. The television program thing was expensive. Hopefully we'll go back to something near normal, but with lots more beneficiaries yet again. Our issues probably going forward as an organisation is that our pipeline of ongoing projects and things that would continue to do kind of came to an end. Twofold, really. Reasons being is that many grant programs that were available for standard run-of-the-mill things that we would normally do, sorry, they're not run-of-the-mill at all. They're fantastic. Standard stuff, non-COVID stuff. A lot of those grant programs stopped in favour of COVID things. Plus, we just haven't really had the time to be fundraising because we've been doing all these things, as Sandra was saying, at the coalface. So the pipeline kind of stopped. And just to give that some context, ordinarily going into April, we'd have 70% of our income. Sort of, we know where that will be coming from for the forthcoming financial year. As it stands this month, 42% of our income is secured. We don't know yet where the rest is coming from. Similarly, our free reserves going into April 2020 were £37,000, whereas this year our free reserves currently sit at £22,000. So that's a reduction in them. We've had to spend these things to try and get that doing. We're confident as an organisation because, we're just confident because you have to be. But we think things will go according to plan. But we are in perhaps a more worrying position than we have been for a long time. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you. I shall unshare screen unless somebody does that for me. There we are.
Great. Thanks a lot, Craig, for that really enlightening tour through what the past year has been like and what the situation looks like now. I'm going to ask attendees now to start thinking about any questions you want to ask us, anything specific to me or to Craig, or indeed to both of us. And you use the Q&A button at the bottom to do that, and I will keep an eye on that and try and either answer the question or put the question to Craig as seems fit. But to kind of kick things off, I mean, to say it's been a roller coaster year is a massive understatement. But what Craig was the kind of most sleepless night thing that was worrying you with the pandemic, and also on the other side of the coin, what's been the best kind of jump in the air and shout yay moment in the past year?
Yeah, I think the sleepless nights have really come from the uncertainty. You're trying to put things in place. As I said earlier on in the slide, we knew that people would be allowed to come back and exercise at some point soon. And we knew that people were going to be allowed to meet outdoors. But when? Those first 2 months, nobody knew anything. That was really, really scary. Worrying about our beneficiaries in those first couple of months as well. I mean, we spent a lot of our time just ringing around people, making sure they were okay. There were worrying times. When it coming to the positives, though, I would say again, I've just highlighted, I think, there the fact that so many of the beneficiaries who are coming along now are complete new faces to us. Means that, I mean, we're always actively trying to seek new beneficiaries wherever we can go, right across the borough of Gateshead. And I think the pandemic, if we are looking at positives, has pushed people in our direction through necessity, through people being on their own a lot more and needing to actually do that extra amount of kind of to get themselves out of the house. Or actually, there's a lot of relatives, so many more relatives now sort of ringing up, my mum or my dad or uncle or whatever, grandfather, is, because they may have seen it on social media, they'd be really interested in this kind of thing, and they're on their own, they're really down. And we can make a difference to these people's lives. That's really good. But yeah, coming back to the sleepless nights, I think a lot of it was just not knowing what was going to happen.
Great. And thinking about the kind of situation at the moment and some of the challenges that you mentioned. So, like many organisations, I think you talked about having to eat into your reserves. And I think for some donors and some funders, reserves is sometimes a bit of a confusing thing, because they kind of think, well, why are organisations sitting on money when they've got things to do? And obviously, we at the Community Foundation always say no, reserves is a sign of an organisation that's well run, because everybody needs a cushion and everybody needs some working capital to be able to dip into to use when they need to, as well as deal with all the kind of liabilities of the organisation. But you've had to dip into it, and you're going to need to obviously think about building that up. But you've also, I think, really, really clearly illustrated the fact that there's been a lot of kind of funny money, special money, COVID money, and actually, when you're looking at the longer term, what are you kind of thinking in terms of the funders, and what kind of conversations are you having with funders, perhaps other than us, about what sort of money might be available, or does it feel like it's very, very uncertain there as well?
It is very interesting, and I think in terms of the point about reserves, I think this year that's just happened, and I appreciate this. Fingers crossed, isn't going to happen every year, but I think this exactly illustrates why organisations need to have reserves. The wheels well and truly came off, and the axles were scraping along the ground, and many, as you say, organisations have really heavily dipped into their reserves, and that's why we need them. It's not a case of sitting on money; it's a case of being able to react to the needs of our beneficiaries when they need us to react, not waiting 3 months down the line for us to wait for a grant application to be processed, etc. The conversations that we're having with funders at the moment are thankfully stemming from the fact that we have. Would have been good if I had a copy. Imagine I got a copy. Would have been coming from the fact that we just launched last week our new strategic plan, which is very much focused around recovery, not necessarily the recovery of the organisation, though fingers crossed that will go hand in hand. But it's about recovery of our beneficiaries. It's about the conversations we're having with our funders, including yourselves. It's about where our beneficiaries are right now, and what the long-term effects of this pandemic are going to be on our beneficiaries going into the future. So many are still shielding. So many are still worried about coming out of the house. We've got lots of new ones, but many of our old ones that we haven't seen for a long time are still concerned and worried about coming out, particularly those who are aged, 75 plus, and our average beneficiary is 77 years old, which means that it means that many of them are going to suffer from this long term. Just seeing people coming back, just seeing the emotions that people are having when they come back through the doors is illustrative and indicative of what they've gone through. And it's not just going to be a quick fix. So the conversations we're having about what can we do about our beneficiaries in the long term, how can we restore them back to where they were, how can we bring them back to fitness? I mean, a lot of what we do, again, is to improve people's physical health, as we've said here. So many people, yes, you've got this current pandemic, but there's going to be a whole new wave, the kind of the deconditioning pandemic, if you will, and based on an article I was reading in the BMJ last week, they're calling it the deconditioning pandemic of older people who have just been sat in the house doing pretty much nothing for the past year, and they're deeply concerned about actually whether they're going to fall or not, what their strength, balance, and mobility is like when they come back out. So the conversations that we're having with our funders are very much focused around our beneficiaries and what they need right now. And what our beneficiaries need now is very different to what they would have needed, say, 18, 24 months ago. Very different landscape.
And Craig, I know you're involved with other organisations and in a kind of personal capacity and networks and what are your kind of perspectives on what's going on for other organisations, both individually but also in the sense of organisations being able to kind of work together and support each other? Has that become harder, easier? Do you think that your experience at the Older People's Assembly is kind of shared elsewhere?
Yeah, I think I do sit on the board of 3 other of charities as well, including Fair Share North East, which has benefited significantly as a result of the pandemic, as you would imagine, because it was very much in the forefront, as you mentioned about the food banks earlier on, in the forefront of those initial conversations in the first 2 months of the pandemic. Many organisations I speak to and I'm working with are in a similar situation to us. They, I don't know if did well is perhaps the best phrase, but were certainly able to access many of these things that you described as funny money earlier. These COVID specific grants, many organisations were able to access those. But again, so it's very much what that does is it increases the cliff edge just that little bit more. So when those other grant funds aren't there to replace them, and you've just been kind of topping up with these COVID specific grants, it's it's difficult. But like you say though, the opportunities to network are, I would say, way more. I think people are more willing to share things. I think again at the very start, sort of March, April last year, everyone was working together. It was fantastic. But those frameworks still exist, and the links that we have with different organisations that we wouldn't have previously worked with continue to grow. The networks that now exist, many voluntary sector, the umbrella organisations. I've forgotten what they're called. The Connected Voice, the CVS type organisations have taken this opportunity to bring people together. The Community Foundation, as you obviously know, has, and there's just local authorities too, bringing people together. And I think what we're going to see is a much more joined up approach. I think when people now realise that there is less money in the overall pot, I think people working to their own individual strengths, or organisations working to their own individual strengths, is going to continue, and it's going to increase because it's not the time for being competitive with other organisations. I mean, it never was, to be fair, anyway, but it really isn't right now.
Right. So a few questions have come through. I think they're mostly for me at the moment. Interesting question about whether we've seen a difference in the resilience of charities between urban and rural locations. And I think the answer is we haven't seen a clear pattern. I think one of the realities in terms of our funding as a community foundation is actually we have disproportionate amounts of money available for our rural areas compared to some of our urban communities, simply because of where some of our donors' interests lie. So sometimes with money like we've had from National Emergency Trust Appeal, we've been able to offset that a bit. It's more, I think, the difference with resilience has been between organisations that have had, as Craig has said, some kind of, have had some reserve that they can fall back on, have got a board of trustees and a kind of, member of staff like Craig who's, spent their time awake at night working out how to deal with all of this stuff, and have been able to adapt. We've had another question about organisations working with Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, and which, as I said, have been disproportionately affected. Some of our grant making through, particularly in money that was raised through our coronavirus appeals, we very deliberately targeted at organisations working with those communities, and that very much ties in with what we're trying to do generally. There's sometimes a challenge with that because some of the money that we received from national appeals, there was an expectation that we would support particular kinds of organisations, some of which don't exist in great numbers in the Northeast. So there are some challenges for us as a funder there, and that continues to be a focus. And many of you hopefully will have seen our new policies around diversity and inclusion, which which we try to going some way to address that. And somebody's asked me the same question I asked you, Craig, which is what's keeping me awake at night in relation to where we are now. And I think I'd probably echo what you said, Craig. It's there is still continued uncertainty. We don't know where this will end. We don't, I think in the UK we're feeling pretty positive, but I am worried about the long-term impacts on communities that were already hard pressed, particularly financially, but also around mental health and older people, and I think that kind of long-term need that is both caused by COVID and exposed by COVID is probably the thing that keeps me awake, and our ability as the foundation to respond to that, and the continued challenge of us doing so effectively. Here is a question that perhaps we can both answer. A question about volunteers. Craig, did you experience issues with losing volunteers? And if you did, have they come back? Will they come back? How has the volunteering side of things impacted you at all?
Significantly. Other than trustees, we've almost all of our volunteers are no longer involved currently with the organisation. We're in regular conversations with them with a view of them coming back. The majority of our volunteers had roles such as running volunteer social groups right across the borough, which would take place indoors. So they're all poised for starting sort of June, July. They would have volunteers who would work in our community cafe or would produce the sandwiches and things like that for the tea dance. Again, none of these things have taken place. So we haven't lost volunteers. Our volunteers, and many of them are still coming along as beneficiaries just to keep in touch and taking part in the social and exercise activities that we have. I do think we will get volunteers back. I think we'll get new volunteers as well. And again, just in the same way we've got new beneficiaries, I think we'll also see some new volunteers, and maybe our volunteer base, as appears to have happened just right across the country, I guess, may actually just get that little bit younger as on average as well. I think there's a lot more people, unfortunately, there's a lot more people experience worklessness. I think the amount of people volunteering is going to increase. We're going to be embarking on an employability program from July, and we're going to try and tie that in with volunteering as well, so give people volunteering opportunities whilst they're seeking employment too. So volunteering and employability is something that we're focusing on.
Yeah, and I think that one of the challenges for kind of established charities and community organisations is a lot of the kind of outpouring of people giving time was through quite informal networks and new kind of hyper local and very street level activities, and kind of translating that into more traditional volunteering, I think is a kind of interesting challenge for the sector. We've seen that whilst people haven't been going to their normal place of work, they've been interested in being engaged in their communities, but it's more challenging to translate that into please come and volunteer for us every Monday afternoon, whilst you're also doing your normal day job. So I think we need wider field of employers to think about how they also support people to contribute to their communities in all these kind of ways. Some more questions coming through. Do you, Craig, see Gateshead Old People's Assembly expanding because of these new clients being engaged? And do you talked about this year being a blip, and you're not necessarily wanting that kind of level of expenditure. But do you see a kind of longer term growth potential, either alone, or perhaps, you know, working with some of those other informal organisations and groupings that might have sprung up during the pandemic?
Yes, so in terms of expansion, definitely that's very much a yes and no to that one. Yes, in terms of the beneficiaries, we were on target for kind of depends which way you want to look at it, but the growth was going up like that year on year for the past 5 years in terms of our beneficiary numbers, in that we have developed a model which allows us to create sustainable activities and ways in which people can support themselves and others within their own communities without us as an organisation necessarily having to grow. So yes, beneficiary numbers, organisation size, not so much, because we don't see, because what we're doing is we're supporting people, again, to support themselves and others within their own communities, which doesn't necessarily need us to have any, you know, organisational growth. So beneficiaries up, organisation back down to normal levels in terms of, you know, staff, income, expenditure, etc. And I think these informal groups, like I say, that have set up, absolutely. And again, these are networks that we're developing and becoming part of and trying to support. It obviously increases a whole range of different safeguarding risks, but those are things that we have in mind. So we're going to continue to, again, the new strategic plan underpins about how for the next 3 years it's going to be about supporting people to support themselves and others within their own communities so that ultimately they don't need us anymore.
And you know, Craig, answer this as you feel comfortable, I think. But I think there's been a really interesting and important question raised about the impact on the mental health and well-being of people working in the sector, working in small charities and community organisations, particularly given that, as you said, you know, mostly we are face-to-face kind of organisations, and people have been more isolated and facing all of these additional pressures and demands. And I guess, how do we recognise that, and how do we address that, and how do we ensure that the people in the sector continue to be supported? I think, you know, we've heard a lot in the media about the impact on the NHS staff and their well-being, and that's really critical. But you know, many charities and community organisations have also been at the front line and will have been impacted in very personal ways. If there's anything you feel you'd like to say about any of that.
Yeah, and just try and keep it brief. The situation, it isn't. It's very much it's you know, sort of frontline voluntary sector workers haven't been exposed to the same things as frontline NHS workers, but they've been badly affected in that kind of way. For example, just as a way around that, or to support that issue, tomorrow we'll work quite closely with the Edwards House charity based also in Gateshead. They oversee the majority of the community link workers right across all of the GP practices and all the PCNs across Gateshead. They've actually taken on 3 or 4 new ones in the past year who've not actually met one another and don't have the opportunity to. So tomorrow afternoon, we're offering a free exercise class for all of the Edwards House community link workers. So they're all coming here tomorrow, and it's just an opportunity for them to relax, let their hair down, meet their colleagues face to face, which they can do legally in a outdoor exercise setting. We're allowed to have up to 30 people together, socially distanced, so we're going to do it in that way. But yes, it's because of recognising that is such an issue, is why I suggested to Jackie, who manages that team of community link workers, that they come up here and kind of use this space to let their hair down. But it's been bad for everyone, as you know.
And I think that helps with another question, which was about similar charities joining together to secure the future of their particular activity areas. I think that you know, the reality is, whilst kind of formal contractual partnerships between small charities are reasonably rare. Actually, the reality on the ground is organisations working in a similar place with similar beneficiary groups collaborate and exchange all the time. And I think, you know, what you're talking about is perhaps some new relationships, but some different relationships, and some organizations working together who knew each other and worked together anyway, but having to find different ways of doing so. So it's, you know, that kind of ecology, if you like, is there anyway. It's kind of not new, I think. There's a kind of question which I'll try and answer, and then perhaps the last one to you, Craig, is about, you know, we've talked about reserves, but what about the point I raised about core funding? Did you kind of have core funding? Did that help with flexibility? Did you have funders that enabled you to be more flexible? Where did that fit, and where might it fit going forward?
Yeah, so with the exception of 2 of our funders, mainly because they're linked to kind of, I guess, central government funds, we were able to exercise maximum flexibility with our grant funds, providing they were in the spirit of the original grant as it was, and that was the general tone coming from the Community Foundation. So thanks for that. The core funds, we probably, I would say, we actively sought as an organisation, because we work around the idea, you know, yes, we've got a strategic plan, but we also try and react to the needs of our beneficiaries as quickly as possible, and recognise that standard grant funds don't often allow for that. So we made an active decision 3 years ago to seek core funding for the organisation, to try and make up around about 1/3 of the income, which is broadly where we are as an organisation. And with that, that means that we are able to react in far more quickly in ways that suit the needs of our beneficiaries. But just even when it's just something small, like, for example, we recently, in fact, we've got a full page in the Sunday Sun at the weekend for anyone who read it. We just recently, it was a very, very small, really inexpensive project, probably cost about 50 quid, because I volunteered with my 12-year-old on a Saturday morning. We printed and laminated some little sheets that said, you know, this is a happy to chat bench. Sit here if you're happy to have a chat. And then we went around various parts of Gateshead and tie wrapped them on to benches. It was a relatively inexpensive project. It's something that we wouldn't have applied for money for, but, you know, core funds and things like that allow us to do things like that. The Wildflower Meadow that you saw the picture of the planting of earlier on, probably all told cost about 700 quid in terms of the seeds and the rotavator and all the stuff. But again, that was something that it met the needs of our beneficiaries. It met the needs of our community at this time, to give people something nice to look at, but it wasn't something that we were going to apply for. So what we did was we used our reserves, and many other examples of the fact that, you know, it's about reacting to the needs of our beneficiaries and being able to use those core funds to do that. You're on mute.
That was going to happen at some point. So mainly because my dog's barking downstairs. So the last question, which I don't think I've covered, is about whether we've lost many charities in the region since the pandemic hit. And I think we at the Community Foundation know of only 1 or 2 isolated examples of established charities that have had to close. I think the reality is it's much more about organisations that have had to shrink or massively change, or in some cases slightly go into hibernation. But also the opposite, as Craig has been explaining, some organisations which have had to kind of step up and expand and do more. So I don't think it's that clear a picture. I think again, it's going to be that long-term impact on what the finance and funding looks like, perhaps in the next 6 to 12 months, which is going to really show us whether there is that kind of impact and we actually start losing organisations. And as I said, not seeing much sign, I'm afraid, of the government kind of looking at long-term ways of making sure that doesn't happen. I'm going to see if we can finish now, and I did say we would do another quick poll just to see what the temperature is like at the end of the meeting. And the poll to finish is really trying to look a bit more at the future, and you'll see there's kind of similar options here, but it's really looking at going ahead, what you think the most kind of critical issues will be. So Ali, could you get the poll up? So this is, last time was about what was the issue, and this is about what do you think will be the single biggest challenge for charities and community organisations in recovering from the pandemic. So again, pick one, from availability of suitable funding, recruiting volunteers, adapting services and ways of working, increased poverty and inequalities and demand from that, and issues around government policy and support. So I'll just give you a few seconds to pick your choice from that list. Okay, Ali, do you want to let us see the results? Okay, that's very interesting. So I think, more than half of you concerned clearly about the impact on our communities and on poverty and inequalities, and the kind of continued stuff around adapting services, and that issue around funding there coming through very strongly. Thank you all for doing that. We're going to wrap up now. I am going to ask, as ever is the case with these things, if we can get you to do a little bit of feedback. So we're going to put a link in the chat to a very brief Survey Monkey, just because this is the first time we've done this kind of thing for donors and fund advisors, and obviously the more we know about what went well for you and what didn't, the more we can shape it in the future. If you don't get a chance to click on the link now from the Survey Monkey, we will put it in an email to you as well. So thank you for coming and giving up your time, but mostly I want to thank Craig. He does the real work, and hundreds and hundreds of organisations like him that we have the privilege of supporting do the real work, and it's a big ask to ask him to step out of the day job this afternoon. So thank you for that, Greg. I think you've really helped bring the conversation to life. And as I said, thank you all for joining us, and hope to see you either virtually or even better in person at a Community Foundation event in the not too distant future. Thank you all for joining us, and have a very good evening. Thank you.